The morning fog hung thick over RAF Hawkinge on the Kent coast, November 12, 1943. Flight Lieutenant James Calloway stood in the dispersal hut, nursing his third cup of weak tea, staring at the silhouette of his aircraft through the grimy window. The Westland Whirlwind sat on the hardstand like a forgotten relic, its twin engines housed in sleek nacelles that gave it an oddly graceful appearance, like a dragonfly that had somehow grown to the size of a small house. Most of the other pilots had already gone up in their Spitfires and Typhoons, the glamorous fighters that filled the recruitment posters and newsreels. But Calloway's Whirlwind remained grounded, as it had been for 3 days, waiting for a replacement part that seemed to exist only in theory. The Westland Whirlwind was an aircraft that nobody quite knew what to do with. Designed in the late 1930s as a long-range fighter, it had entered service in 1940 with great expectations. It was the RAF's first single-seat, twin-engine fighter, armed with 4 20mm Hispano cannons clustered in the nose, giving it devastating firepower. On paper, it was a world-beater. In practice, it had become a maintenance nightmare and a tactical puzzle. The twin Rolls-Royce Peregrine engines were powerful but temperamental, prone to overheating, and worst of all, they were orphans in the RAF's logistics system. Rolls-Royce had stopped production of the Peregrine to focus on the Merlin engine that powered Spitfires and Hurricanes, which meant spare parts for the Whirlwind were rarer than competent staff officers. By 1943, most Whirlwind squadrons had been disbanded or re-equipped with other aircraft. Squadron 263, Calloway's unit, was one of only 2 remaining Whirlwind squadrons, and there were persistent rumors that they too would soon convert to Typhoons. The aircraft had been relegated to ground attack missions, fighter-bomber work along the French coast, the kind of dangerous, unglamorous missions that didn't make headlines. The other pilots called it the Whirly Bomber, with a mixture of affection and derision. They said it was too slow for fighter work, too complex for its own good, too specialized to be useful. Too slow to catch anything, too fast to be safe, was how squadron leader Bentley had described it, and the description had stuck. Calloway had a different opinion, but he'd learned to keep it mostly to himself. He'd been flying Whirlwinds for 18 months now, through dozens of missions, strafing trains, attacking coastal convoys, and dodging German flak over occupied France. He knew the aircraft's reputation: maximum speed of around 360 miles per hour at altitude, slower than a Spitfire Mark 9 by a good 40 miles per hour, much slower than the new German Focke-Wulf 190s that could hit 400 miles per hour in level flight. On paper, in a straight race, the Whirlwind would lose every time. But Calloway had learned that aerial combat was rarely about straight races. It was about energy management, tactical thinking, and knowing your aircraft's strengths and your enemy's weaknesses. The door to the dispersal hut banged open, and Sergeant Davies rushed in, his face flushed with excitement or exertion or both. "Sir, the parts arrived. We can have you airborne in 30 minutes. Calloway set down his tea. "About bloody time. What's the operation?" Davies glanced at the operations board. "Shipping strike, sir. Intelligence reports a small convoy moving along the French coast near Dieppe. 2 squadrons of Typhoons are going in as the main strike force. You're tasked with top cover and opportunistic targets." Top cover. That meant flying above the main attack, watching for German fighters. It was actually a fighter mission, not ground attack, which was unusual for a Whirlwind these days. Perhaps someone in operations had finally remembered that the aircraft had been designed as a fighter. 35 minutes later, Calloway was strapped into the Whirlwind's cockpit, running through the pre-flight checks. The cockpit was cramped but well laid out, everything within easy reach. The visibility was excellent, the long nose providing an unobstructed view forward, the canopy giving good coverage to the sides and rear. He started the engines one at a time, the Peregrines coughing, and then settling into a smooth, synchronized rumble. The sound was distinctive, different from the throaty roar of a Merlin, higher-pitched, almost musical, when the engines were properly synchronized. The Whirlwind taxied smoothly, the tricycle landing gear giving it better ground handling than the tail draggers most pilots were used to. It was one of the aircraft's underappreciated virtues. He took off into the grey November sky, the Whirlwind accelerating quickly down the runway and lifting off cleanly. The climb rate was good, better than most people expected from a twin-engine fighter. At 8,000 feet, he leveled off and set course for the Channel, adjusting the engine controls to cruise settings, watching the temperature gauges with the attention they demanded. The Peregrine engines ran hot, always, and overheating could turn deadly very quickly. The Channel crossing took 20 minutes, the white cliffs of Dover disappearing behind him, the grey-green water of the Channel passing below. He maintained radio silence, as per orders, navigating by compass and clock. At the French coast, he could see the Typhoons below and ahead, 12 aircraft in 3 flights of 4, heading toward their target. He maintained his altitude, scanning the sky constantly. This was the dangerous part. German fighters based at airfields in France would be scrambling to intercept the strike, and they would come with altitude advantage. 5 miles inland, his eyes caught movement high and to the south. He focused, squinting against the grey sky, and made out 4 specks at about 12,000 feet. Even at this distance, he could identify them by their flight pattern and silhouette. Focke-Wulf 190s. The FW-190 was Germany's finest fighter, introduced in 1941 and steadily improved since then. It was fast, heavily armed, and flown by experienced pilots who had learned their deadly trade over years of war. The standing orders were clear. If you encountered 190s, call them in and evade. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary. The Typhoons were good aircraft, but the 190s had an edge. And a whirlwind against 190s. Nobody had written orders for that scenario because nobody thought it would happen. You couldn't catch them, and if they caught you, you were dead. Calloway keyed his radio. Mongoose leader, this is Mongoose 2. 4 bandits, 12 o'clock high, Angels 12. Mongoose 2, Mongoose leader acknowledges, maintain your position, we're almost at target. The Typhoons were committed to their attack run. They couldn't break off now. That meant Calloway's job was to keep those 190s occupied, or at least warned off, until the strike was complete. He watched the German fighters, trying to read their intentions. They were circling, clearly aware of the Typhoons below, but not yet committed to an attack. They had the altitude, they had the speed, they could strike whenever they wanted. They were being cautious, professional, waiting for the right moment. Then the situation changed. One of the 190s broke formation and began a diving turn toward the Typhoons. The others followed, a classic boom and zoom attack, coming down with the sun behind them. Mongoose leader, bandits attacking, 4 190s, diving on your position. Mongoose leader sees them, all Mongoose aircraft, continue attack. They're too far. The Typhoon leader was making a calculated decision. They were seconds away from their attack point. If they broke off now, the mission would be a failure. They were gambling that they could complete their attack and escape before the 190s reached firing position. It was a reasonable gamble, but Calloway could see the geometry of the situation, could calculate speeds and angles, and he knew they wouldn't make it. The 190s would be in firing range just as the Typhoons were pulling off their attack runs at their most vulnerable moment. Unless someone did something incredibly stupid. Calloway pushed the control column forward and shoved the throttles to maximum power. The Whirlwind's nose dropped, and the aircraft accelerated rapidly into a steep dive. He was at 8,000 feet. The 190s were at 12,000, now descending rapidly toward the Typhoons at 6,000. He couldn't climb to intercept them, but he could dive to cut them off. The airspeed indicator wound up rapidly, 300 miles per hour, 320, 340. The Whirlwind was built strongly, and it could dive fast. The whole aircraft began to shake, the controls stiffening as the airspeed increased. 360, 380. The altimeter unwound, 7,000 feet, 6,500, 6,000. He pulled back on the control column, grunting against the G-forces, pulling out of the dive into a slashing climb that pointed him directly at the diving 190s. They saw him, probably couldn't believe what they were seeing. A lone aircraft, a whirlwind of all things, climbing to intercept 4 Focke-Wulf 190s. It was insane. It was also exactly what Calloway had intended. The lead 190 had to make a decision. Continue his attack on the Typhoons and risk having this crazy British pilot on his tail, or break off and deal with the threat. He chose the latter. The 190 rolled left and pulled into a climbing turn, breaking off his attack. His wingman followed automatically. The second pair of 190s, seeing their leaders break off, also hesitated. The coordinated attack had been disrupted. Below, the Typhoons completed their attack run, their rockets streaking toward the coastal convoy, and then they were pulling up and accelerating away, safe for the moment. But Calloway's moment of tactical success had put him in a very dangerous position. He was now alone, at 8,000 feet, with 4 very angry German pilots who were now fully focused on him. The lead 190 completed his climbing turn and came around, pointing his nose at Calloway's Whirlwind. Even at this distance, Calloway could see the muzzle flashes as the German opened fire, long-range shots meant to unnerve rather than hit. He broke left, rolling the Whirlwind into a tight turn. The aircraft responded beautifully, the controls still light despite the speed. This was one of the Whirlwind's secrets. It handled well across a wide speed range. It wasn't the fastest, but it was predictable, stable, and responsive. The 190 tried to follow the turn, but Calloway had judged the angles correctly. The German was too fast from his dive, and he couldn't tighten his turn radius without bleeding off speed. He flashed past, 100 meters away, close enough for Calloway to see the pilot's head turn to track him. Then the 190 was gone, extending away, climbing to regain altitude for another pass. Standard boom and zoom tactics. Dive, attack, climb back to safety. Don't dogfight, don't turn, use your speed. But the other 3 190s were still there, positioning for their attacks. Calloway looked around frantically, assessing the situation. He was outnumbered, his aircraft was supposedly outclassed, and he was over enemy territory with nowhere to run. The smart thing would be to dive for the deck and run for the channel at maximum speed. He might make it. He probably wouldn't. The second 190 was diving on him now, coming from the right and above. Calloway waited, watching, his hand on the throttle controls. The Whirlwind had twin engines, independently controlled. That gave him options. At the last moment, as the 190 committed to his attack run, Calloway chopped the throttle on the left engine and pushed full power on the right. The Whirlwind yawed violently to the left, skidding sideways through the air. It was an old barnstorming trick, not something you were supposed to do in combat. But it worked. The 190's cannon fire passed through the space where Calloway had been a second earlier. The German pilot, surprised, pulled up and climbed away. But the maneuver had cost Calloway energy and altitude. He was now at 7,000 feet, his airspeed had dropped to barely 250 miles per hour, and he had 2 more 190s lining up for attacks. This was the situation that killed pilots, the trap that German fighters had perfected. Multiple attackers taking turns, each forcing the defender to maneuver, to bleed speed and altitude, until there was nothing left, and the final attack was just execution. Calloway needed to change the dynamic, but how? He couldn't outrun them, he couldn't outclimb them. In a turning fight, the 190 wasn't as maneuverable as a Spitfire, but it was good enough, and there were 4 of them. 1 against 4, even with perfect turns, he would lose. Then he remembered something from the intelligence briefings, a technical detail that most pilots ignored because it seemed irrelevant. The Focke-Wulf 190's BMW radial engine was powerful, but it used a mechanical supercharger with a single-gear ratio. Above a certain altitude, around 7,000 or 8,000 meters, the 190's performance dropped off. The engine couldn't maintain full power in the thinner air. Below that altitude, the 190 was king. But at very low altitude, right down on the deck, the performance equation changed again. Calloway made his decision. He rolled the Whirlwind inverted and pulled the nose down into a vertical dive. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. The 190s followed, but more cautiously now. A vertical dive into ground level was dangerous. 1 moment's inattention and you'd auger in. At 1,000 feet, Calloway pulled out, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, his vision graying at the edges. The Whirlwind groaned but held together. He leveled off at 500 feet, barely clearing the trees of the French countryside, his airspeed reading 380 miles per hour from the dive. Behind and above, the 190s were pulling out of their dives, spacing themselves for another series of attacks. But now the rules had changed. Down here, at 500 feet, there was no room for boom and zoom tactics. You couldn't dive because there was nowhere to dive to. The fight would be level or climbing, a test of acceleration and sustained speed. And this was where the Whirlwind's design, so often criticized, became an advantage. The twin Peregrine engines, for all their maintenance issues, were powerful. Combined, they produced nearly 2,000 horsepower. The aircraft was heavy, but it was also streamlined, with careful attention paid to reducing drag. The long nose, the sleek engine nacelles, the carefully fared surfaces, all of it contributed to an aircraft that, in level flight at low altitude, was faster than its reputation suggested. Calloway pushed the throttles to maximum continuous power and pointed the nose at the channel 15 miles away. The Whirlwind accelerated smoothly, 300 miles per hour, 320, 340. He glanced back and saw the Wonder 90s in pursuit, 4 grey sharks chasing one lone fish. But the gap wasn't closing as quickly as it should have been. The Wonder 90s were fast, very fast, but their best performance was at medium altitude, 15,000 to 20,000 feet. Down here, barely clearing the treetops, their radial engines were gulping thick air and their speed advantage was reduced. They were still faster, but not by as much. The lead 190 had closed to about 600 meters and opened fire. Calloway saw the tracer rounds reaching out, bright streaks in the grey morning light. He jinked left, then right, small movements, not wasting energy. The rounds passed wide. The German pilot was firing at extreme range, probably frustrated, trying to force Calloway into a mistake. The French coast was ahead, 10 miles, 9 miles, 8 miles. If he could make it to the channel, he'd have a chance. The Royal Navy and RAF maintained air-sea rescue services. The Germans did too, but their coverage over the channel was less comprehensive. But the Wonder 90s were still there, still closing, and Calloway's fuel situation was becoming critical. The Whirlwind had good range for a fighter, but he'd been running at maximum power for several minutes now, and the Peregrine engines were thirsty when pushed hard, 7 miles to the coast. The lead 190 was now at 400 meters and closing, clearly determined. The German pilot had steadied his aircraft, was flying smoothly, preparing for a careful, aimed shot. Calloway knew he couldn't keep jinxing forever. Each maneuver bled speed, and speed was the only thing keeping him alive. He needed to do something unexpected, something that would break the Germans' timing. He armed his 4 20mm cannons. The Whirlwind carried 60 rounds per gun, 240 rounds total. He hadn't fired yet, had been saving his ammunition. The cannons were his only real advantage, pure firepower. The Wonder 90 had cannons too, but they were spread out, 2 in the wing roots, 2 in the outer wings. The Whirlwind's cannons were all clustered in the nose, right in front of the pilot. When they fired, all 4 barrels converged on a single point. At close range, the concentration of fire was devastating. But the German was behind him, not in front. Calloway couldn't shoot what he couldn't see, unless he made the German come to where he could see him. 6 miles to the coast, the Wonder 90 was at 300 meters now, well within firing range. Calloway could almost feel the German pilot's finger tightening on the trigger. He chopped both throttles to idle and popped the dive brakes. The Whirlwind didn't have dedicated dive brakes like some aircraft, but Calloway lowered the landing gear manually. The sudden drag was tremendous. The Whirlwind decelerated violently, as if it had hit a wall. Behind him, the 190 pilot, focused on his gun sight, didn't react fast enough. Suddenly, instead of being 300 meters behind, he was 100 meters behind and closing rapidly. Too close, far too close. The German pilot had a split second to make a decision: pull up and overshoot, or try to reduce speed to stay behind. He chose the latter, pulling his throttle back, but it was too late. The 190's superior speed, its greatest asset, had become a liability. The Focke-Wulf shot forward, pulling alongside Calloway's Whirlwind, barely 50 meters away. For one frozen moment, the 2 pilots could see each other clearly, eye to eye, 2 men in cockpits hurtling through the air at 300 miles per hour, so close they could see the individual features of each other's faces. The German pilot's eyes widened as he realized his mistake. Calloway shoved the throttles forward, retracted the landing gear, and rolled the Whirlwind hard right, turning toward the 190, bringing his nose to bear. His thumb found the firing button on the control column. The four 20mm Hispano cannons erupted in a thunder that shook the entire airframe. At 50 meters range, he couldn't miss. The shells, each the size of a man's thumb, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, slammed into the Focke-Wulf's left wing and fuselage. Calloway fired for 2 seconds, a lifetime in aerial combat. 30 shells, 7.5 pounds of high explosive and metal, impacted the German fighter. He saw pieces fly off, saw the canopy shatter, saw the left wing crumple. The 190 snap-rolled right and went into a vertical dive. It hit the ground 3 seconds later, a massive explosion that sent a pillar of black smoke into the sky. Calloway pulled back on the control column, climbing, scanning the sky for the other 3 190s. He found them a mile behind, pulling up and away, disengaging. They'd seen their leader go down and apparently decided that this particular British pilot was more trouble than he was worth. Or perhaps they were low on fuel. Either way, they were leaving. Calloway didn't pursue. He was low on fuel himself, his hands were shaking from adrenaline, and he'd just used a significant portion of his luck for the entire year. He turned toward the coast, now just 4 miles away, and crossed over the French shoreline at 500 feet, the channel spreading before him, grey and cold and beautiful. He'd made it. 5 minutes later, he was over water, climbing to a safer altitude. His fuel gauge was showing nearly empty, but he had enough. Just enough. The flight back to Hawkinge took 30 minutes that felt like 3 hours. When he finally saw the white cliffs and then the airfield, he felt the tension drain from his body, leaving him almost too tired to fly. He landed, taxied to his hardstand, and shut down the engines. The sudden silence was deafening. Sergeant Davies and the ground crew were running toward the aircraft, their faces excited. They'd heard the radio chatter, knew something had happened. Calloway opened the canopy and climbed out, his legs unsteady. Davies reached him first, breathless. "Sir, is it true? Did you really engage 4 190s?" Calloway nodded, not trusting his voice yet. "And you shot one down, a 190, in a whirlwind?" "Yes, Sergeant." Davies let out a whoop and turned to the other mechanics. I told you this aircraft was better than they said." Squadron leader Bentley arrived minutes later, striding across the hardstand with the purposeful walk of a commander who has heard an improbable story and wants to verify it personally. "Calloway, report." Calloway gave him the facts, briefly and without embellishment. The interception, the diving attack to break up the German formation, the running fight at low level, the maneuver that let him bring his guns to bear, the kill. Bentley listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Calloway finished, there was a long silence. "You engaged 4 Focke-Wulf 190s in a whirlwind?" "Yes, sir." "And not only survived, but shot down the leader?" "Yes, sir." Another long silence. Then Bentley shook his head slowly. "James, you're either the bravest pilot I've ever met, or the most foolish. Possibly both." He paused. "But you saved those Typhoons. They all made it home because you bought them time." "Just doing my job, sir?" "Well beyond your job, I'd say." Bentley glanced at the whirlwind, at the empty cannon ports, at the scorch marks from the guns. "And you say you outran them? At low altitude?" "Not outran, sir. More like, didn't fall behind as quickly as they expected." Bentley actually smiled at that. "I'll need to file a full report. This will go up the chain. Nobody's going to believe that a whirlwind engaged 190s in air-to-air combat and won. It goes against everything we think we know about the aircraft." In the days that followed, Calloway's combat report did indeed go up the chain of command, each level receiving it with more skepticism than the last. Whirlwinds didn't fight 190s. They were too slow, too specialized, too obsolete. But the facts were undeniable. The Typhoons confirmed the engagement. British radar had tracked the combat, and French resistance members reported the crashed 190 and recovered the pilot's body and identity documents. He had been Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner, an experienced pilot with 17 confirmed kills. His squadron commander would later write in a letter home that Brenner had been killed in action over France, in circumstances that remain unclear. The story spread through RAF fighter command like wildfire. The Whirlwind, that forgotten fighter that everyone said was too slow, had not only engaged, but killed a Focke-Wulf 190 in air-to-air combat. The details of how it happened, the tactical acumen and desperation that had made it possible, were sometimes lost in the retelling. But the core fact remained. In the right circumstances, with the right pilot, even an obsolete, under-maintained, allegedly too slow aircraft could defeat the enemy's best. Calloway himself was recommended for a Distinguished Flying Cross. The recommendation made its way through the approval process, gathering endorsements from officers who wanted to be associated with the story. In March 1944, he received the medal at a small ceremony at Hawkinge, with his squadron mates in attendance. The Whirlwind's reprieve was temporary. By mid-1944, Squadron 263 was indeed re-equipped with Typhoons, as had long been rumoured. The few remaining Whirlwinds were withdrawn from service, relegated to training roles or scrapped. The type had never lived up to its initial promise, had never become the world-beating fighter its designers had envisioned. But for a few pilots like Calloway, who had taken the time to understand its quirks and capabilities, it had been a good aircraft, better than its reputation suggested. Years after the war, aviation historians would debate the Whirlwind's place in RAF history. Most agreed it had been a disappointment, a dead-end design, superseded by better aircraft. But they also noted the oddity of its combat record. A fighter that was supposedly too slow for air-to-air combat had a higher victory-to-loss ratio in fighter versus fighter engagements than it had any right to have. Calloway flew Typhoons for the rest of the war, then Tempests, participating in the campaign across Europe after D-Day. He survived the war with 12 confirmed victories, most of them in ground attack missions. But that single Focke-Wulf 190 remained his most memorable kill. In 1946, demobilized and trying to adjust to civilian life, he attended an air show at Farnborough. Among the historical aircraft on display was a Westland Whirlwind, one of the few that had been preserved. He stood in front of it for a long time, looking at the sleek lines, the twin engines, the cluster of cannon ports in the nose. A young man, barely 20, approached and read the placard beside the aircraft. Westland Whirlwind, heavy fighter and ground attack aircraft, maximum speed 360 miles per hour, obsolete by 1943. Poor performance led to early withdrawal from service. He turned to Calloway. Sounds like it was a bit of a disaster, wasn't it? Calloway looked at the young man, then back at the aircraft. It was complicated, he said finally. Good at some things, not so good at others. Like most aircraft. Like most people, really. But it says here it was too slow for fighter work. Calloway smiled slightly. Speed isn't everything. Sometimes being too slow just means the enemy underestimates you. That can be an advantage. The young man looked puzzled, not understanding. Calloway didn't elaborate. How could you explain to someone who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the controls of a Whirlwind in their hands, who hadn't seen that Focke-Wulf 190 pulling alongside, so close you could see the pilot's face? How could you explain that sometimes the aircraft everyone said was inadequate could surprise you, could do things it wasn't supposed to be able to do, if you knew it well enough and were desperate enough and lucky enough? The Westland Whirlwind remained a footnote in aviation history, a might have been, a design that had promised much and delivered less. Only 114 production aircraft were ever built, compared to over 20,000 Spitfires. It never received the glory, never became iconic, never appeared on recruiting posters or in movies. But for a handful of pilots who flew it, who understood it, who pushed it beyond what the specifications said it could do, it was something more than a footnote. It was an aircraft that taught them that limitations were often in the minds of the people who wrote specifications, not in the metal and wood and fabric of the machine itself. That speed wasn't the only measure of success. That sometimes the underdog could win not by being better at what everyone else valued, but by being good at something nobody else had thought to measure. James Calloway lived to the age of 83, dying peacefully in 1994. In his study, among the photographs and medals and memorabilia of a long life, there was a small model of a Westland Whirlwind, hand-built, painted in the colors of Squadron 263. Visitors would sometimes ask about it, about the obscure aircraft that nobody remembered. He would tell them the story, sometimes the short version, sometimes the long version, with all the details of that November morning in 1943, and he would always end the same way. Everyone said she was too slow, and maybe she was, on paper, by the numbers. But numbers don't tell you everything. Sometimes they don't tell you anything at all. That day, when it mattered, when lives were on the line, she was fast enough. And that's all that mattered. The model Whirlwind sat on his desk, a reminder not of what might have been, but of what actually was. A pilot and his aircraft, facing impossible odds and finding a way to win.